So excited to have you here. I haven't taught web archiving in a whole year, which sounds kind of like maybe not that significant, but I really love web archiving and I've spent a lot of time teaching it. I've been doing research and working on web archiving since at least 2007. I started studying digital preservation when I was still an art student a very, very long time ago. So anyway, I have probably met some of you via IIPC, the International Internet Preservation Consortium, some via Rhizome and Web Recorder, some via Columbia and IB Plus, some via NIARC, any number of ways. So I'm thrilled to have those of you I know on the line, as well as new faces, which albeit I can't see, but I'm really glad to have you here. So thank you. So this is the first of a series of 5 webinars on web archiving. So I want to get everybody up to speed on what I mean by web archiving, because it isn't obvious. So by web archiving, I mean the collection, management, and stewardship of web resources in a stable form. So as in a work file. I'll explain a little bit more about what a work file is soon. But the purpose of this is so it can be accessed over time independently of the original. So if a web page or a web resource goes offline, the web archive will provide ongoing access. So why archive web resources? Some people, it's like, duh, but other people, like, it needs to be a little clearer. So I think that to accurately represent experiences and materials created in the 21st century, at least select websites and other web-based resources should be captured. So like a functional copy should be made, and that copy should be stored, and it should be managed and described and made accessible. And made accessible over the short term and the long term. And if that's not enough of an explanation, like thinking more in terms of current events and crises, and online spaces and web-based media they're crucial elements, and a lot of important information would be lost and or omitted in the absence of web archiving. There were a lot of errant tweets for quite a while that had real impact. And there are other things online that are just, I think, so essential to remember when thinking about what's going on right now. So I will go on about other reasons why web archiving is something to make a priority. There is a lot of content available primarily or solely online that used to be in print. Born digital information is generally at risk, by comparison to analog materials, but web-based materials are even more at risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is soon. One of the reasons is that websites, while freely available and widely accessible right now, they can disappear at any time, per the volition of a site owner or a service provider. Amazon Web Services can say, this content is a violation of our terms of service. They have done this. In some ways, in one of those instances, especially, I would agree with them. But the possibility exists in other circumstances, be it Amazon Web Services or another service provider. When I referred to digital materials being more vulnerable, and being more vulnerable, say, in comparison to analog media, it would be a lot harder to lose, 10 linear feet of Hollinger boxes than to accidentally, with a few keystrokes, delete a web archive or any other group of digital files. So curated collections of web archives can also be a valuable addition to a part of an existing collection and fit into collection development that exists for other materials. And there are also materials in collections that used to be on paper and now are web-based or entirely online. And some of these things I think many of us would take for granted, but in talking to university archivists, you learn and are reminded that course catalogs are, essential to their operations, but they would be very easily lost because right now, a lot of students are accessing their course options via a database that is not easily preserved, and the search function is not preservable. So, how do you get this information? How do you save this information? Is maybe a super big PDF static copy okay? Yeah, probably. There's a decent chance that's okay. But remembering that needs to be obtained in some way is essential. And then in terms of other PDFs and information that would otherwise get out there on paper, thinking about publicity materials, announcements for events, press kits, brochures, things that used to be on paper. And, it being available via the web is exciting in some ways because you don't need to physically go to certain places to get certain information, but it's also not going to be easily recovered from a file folder in 20 years if it's not proactively collected now. So web archiving is a multi-step process. And when people think about web archiving, they often get really stuck on the collecting and the harvest. So the gathering of the materials, and don't think as much about collection development and planning or the selection process. Often permissions and ethics are an afterthought at best, but they should really be considered up top. And then, the harvesting, collecting, again, that's I think the most clear part of web archiving in terms of its value in the process. But then also, description, access, and long-term preservation. Again, they're essential. These aren't optional. These are all part of the process. And I'm a visual person, and having worked on a tool that was really focused on visual accuracy and like full interactivity, I wanted to highlight something that is going to be like a theme in this presentation. Is the context, is the way that the website looks also content? Is it essential? Are there visual elements or interactive features that make that site what it is, or are they non-essential? So like, does it matter if the videos don't play? Does it matter if images are missing? Does it matter if certain animations don't appear? That said, if your purpose in the near term is to do a big digital humanities project with massive text analysis, maybe you don't care. Maybe you just want the text. So thinking about that is really important. And then, so as I was saying, is the experience of usage essential to capture? And, the example before, the course catalog, maybe people don't really care like how searching and browsing worked. And that's cool. Like that's fine. But when you think about, say, certain ebooks that are made on web-based platforms such as like Scalar, that publication was fundamentally formed around the way the materials interacted. With a platform like that, it's not just kind of a page turning function to mimic a physical book. It's really fundamentally a different approach to putting together a story and using materials that are not text on page. You're using sometimes videos or other things that are media rich and not analogous to a print copy. And time and time again, we know, and anybody who's doing web archiving will find, is social media is hard. There are teams of developers at sometimes multi-billion-dollar companies working on these platforms to fine-tune them, to make them perform better, make them sometimes more opaque. So it's really hard for web archiving teams, and software developers to keep up with these massive, sometimes seemingly arbitrary changes. So it is important to recognize that social media is hard. There are certain teams that are really transparent about how hard it is and why certain things aren't possible, which I admire. It doesn't solve the problem, but it's just something to really keep in mind. And, when setting expectations about web archiving, fine, let's keep these things in mind. And I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about what web archiving is not. And, IMHO, as in my humble opinion, there are some people who might disagree with this on certain points, but for the purposes of web archiving in this presentation, in this series, here's what I mean. So web archiving is not static screenshots. It's not interactive fixed images. It's not a screen recording of an interaction with the site. So it's not, a simple picture of a page. It's not a page that you can't interact with. It's not, a video of your process of using the site. It's not a play, kind of like with the screen recording of the interaction with the site, thinking of it kind of like a playthrough for video games or something like that. That could be interesting. There's room for that as supplemental materials to a web archive, but that's not a web archive. Stockpiling massive quantities of data without a specific strategy for selection, management, and preservation, also not web archiving as far as I see it. There were some scholars outside of web archiving who wrote more than one paper on how, in their opinion, YouTube is a web archive. And I don't agree with that. I think unless your collection development plan would be to document an enormous, uncurated, massive data, YouTube wouldn't be a web archive. P.S. If you did that, it would be nearly impossible to steward, to keep responsibly long-term, or make accessible on an enduring basis. It would be financially really hard and environmentally impactful in a way that I don't think is a good use of resources, either financially or just climate-wise. Data storage and access takes resources. And, for web archives, some people are like, well, should I feel guilty about making a web archive? And it's like, no, or storing a modestly sized web archive. No, I mean, like an evening browsing Netflix or shopping, like you're also consuming resources. So I wouldn't be too hard on collecting. It's not nothing, but I do think holding the field to realistic standards is important. The final thing that confuses some people about web archiving is using the web as a space to share digital archives. So yes, you are using the web to host a platform for sharing digital archives. You are not, however, making a web archive for the purposes of web archiving as I am talking about. So it's a really common misunderstanding, and it's, you've got the word web, you've got the word archive, there are a lot of different spaces for misunderstanding, but I explicitly am not talking about using web spaces employed as a platform or environment for sharing digital archives. There are some platforms that are being built to share digital archives, such as Archipelago, so tune into the next session for information about that. But that is, again, it's a space for sharing multiple content types, including web archives. So making web collections it's not easy. And I think we are currently missing some essential tools. I would like to see some growth in the availability of tools. And there are certain factors I think are essential in having an ideal tool set. And maybe this is an impossible task, but I would like to see something that's fully functional, that can make, an accurate copy that it can be browsed as though it was the original website, something that's easy to use and designed well. So any tool that the first line of the documentation is open the command line and, yeah, I'm out. Like I can do that to some extent, but any end user, especially someone new to web archiving, that's a showstopper. That's like game over. This isn't for me. I'd like to see something open source, and that, again, not easy. And with open source, it's a trade-off, and you really do need to remember that it's not air quotes free, because there are humans behind that, and those humans need to eat, they need to be housed, and they deserve to be compensated for what they do. On that same note, I'd like to see tools that are sustainable and well maintained and tested. And that's a tall order too. There is a lot of emphasis put on innovation, and hopefully there's kind of growing recognition of the need for maintenance. But I think, as a society, we really have that very human tendency to say, ooh, shiny, or like looking at the next thing, what's upcoming, and not being too as concerned with maintenance of things that we use. Then last but not least, widely accessible and affordable with transparent pricing. We've all heard that, if the service is free, you're paying with your data. I don't think that should be a business model for web archives. I don't Yeah, I mean, on any number of levels. It would be nice to have something where you can start for free, and you know what you're in for if you do more. Again, tall order to ask. In the absence of said ideal tools, here are some questions for you. What can you afford? What's good enough? What's good enough for now? What do you want long term? And behind those questions, why are you doing this? Who's it for? And how long into the future is the, the population you're doing this for expected to want or need this? There are some essential terms to web archiving. So the predominant method for collecting web pages is via a crawler, which we used to also call spider or a robot. I think crawler kind of won out as a term. It's automated software that traverses web pages with, per the directions of a human. So by traverses, I mean it goes from page to page per a certain set of instructions that's been given to it. Crawlers are used for indexing in a lot of cases. So like for you to be able to do a Google search, Google has indexed massive quantities of data to know what to feed the search algorithms. For web archiving, we're more interested in capture. So again, making this functional copy, not just understanding the contents within the pages. Human scale or browser-based web collecting, that was the method I was advocating for on my last project. And that was collecting as guided by a human in real time through a web browser. So again, you're not making a screen recording of the process of browsing the pages, you're making an interactive copy of the pages you visit. And then seed URL, that's most applicable for the crawler method, but at the same time, it applies to any web archiving project because it's just your starting point for collecting. So it could be a domain level, it could be metro.org, or it could be a certain directory, so like Metro's event section, or a page level, so just about a particular webinar or program, something like that. So that's the concept of seed URL. WARC file, I had mentioned before, as being the ISO standard file format for web archives. It's just the de facto standard at this point, and I think that's fine. Sometimes you will get a, air quotes, web archive from, Facebook, like your personal download, which I find to be like almost aggressively unuseful. Like it just doesn't function. It's just a mess. So like I really think work files should be considered what you're looking for when you are making a web archive. Fidelity and quality, again, the similarity to the original in terms of the way it looks, in terms of the way it works, in terms of what's present. And then significant properties, this is kind of like an archival term that some people are more into than others. I'm really into it, and it's basically like the defining features of an object or resource and what makes something what it is and what distinguishes it from other things. And as I said, there's some slides later for us to do an exercise on that, because I know it's kind of abstract, but there's a certain way that I tend to explain it or kind of help people unpack. So the frequent web archiving genesis to keep in mind, and I've heard this many times, and some of you have maybe also experienced it, is, I was just informed that an essential web resource, such as my organization's homepage, is about to be taken down, deleted, redesigned. It's happening soon, like within the next weeks or months. And, the question to the archivist or from the archivist is, how do I save a functional copy for future use? And can I do this within a month or so? Like, it's better to be planning ahead for that. And it's going to happen, right? Website redesigns happen. It's just important to keep in mind. Sometimes, however, when someone comes to an administrator with said concern, they will hear back, isn't this all just in the Internet Archive? Like, why do we need to invest in this? Like the time, the money, all that stuff, like what, but why? In response to that, I would first check the Internet Archive. Is what you're looking for there? Is it good enough? Does it represent what you need? If so, can you get a copy? Because, if you have responsibility for this content, you should probably have your own copy. So there are also training materials for advocacy, and I've actually done like a webinar or two on this as well. I think DPC, the Digital Preservation Coalition, has a recording of one of the webinars I did on advocacy, but there are other resources available. Like, by all means, I'm not the sole authority on this. Talking about the benefits of web archiving, and you need to set expectations, you need to be aware of limits, but you also don't want to be discouraging. It's just so hard because like there's such a high standard for the live web and what we do day to day, and to really capture that and represent it is hard. I mean, it's truly difficult. One way of approaching this, like on an organizational scale though, is like collecting strategy and getting other people involved. And sometimes other people being involved is, figuring out what's important, what to collect. Maybe they'd suggest URLs that are relevant to that topic. Maybe they'd liaise with site owners, solicit permission to collect those websites. So for example, when I worked at Columbia, one of our pilot collections was the Contemporary Composers Web Archive. And the collection theme was to get the websites of composers that were well represented in the physical collections and the other collections in the music libraries of the Ivy Plus institutions. So the music librarians nominated, there was an analysis of, who was collected most and where, so that was part of it. But then the music librarians would also suggest URLs. And, if there was a connection there, maybe they would solicit permission directly. Often we would send a permissions request as well. And then the music librarians also sometimes did us a great service of browsing the web archives for quality and saying, this is present, this is not present, just FYI, like if you can go back and get these pieces, I'd really appreciate it. But testing is so important. The shared responsibility sometimes of governance, again with Ivy Plus, it is collaboratively curated and collaboratively funded. So that was a process to negotiate, but that was a point for shared responsibility. We started to touch on, how do you connect existing policy and goals with what you'd get with web archives? Why collect it? For whom? How often? And what's the purpose? I'm repeating myself a fair amount in this presentation intentionally because there's certain points that I want to kind of hammer home or like really reinforce or explain more throughout the presentation, because I think the first or maybe even second or third time you hear about this, it doesn't necessarily like intuitively make sense to people new to the topic. So collecting and ethics, this is not an afterthought. I mean, it's something that maybe wasn't part of the discussion from day one in every collection or collecting initiative, but like at Rhizome, in collaboration with Documenting the Now, we did a 3-day conference on ethics and archiving the web. And 2 of those days, the video recordings of the presentations, these really excellent panels, is on Vimeo. It is freely accessible, and I'd encourage you to check it out. And some of the big questions that were touched on there and that you would ask yourselves is, who's at risk? What's the potential for harm? Is the risk high? Is the risk low? Are we respecting the intellectual property and rights of the creators of this content? Do they understand the implications of their content being collected? Remembering and helping them understand within reason, like the bigger picture, and fundamentally, archives are useful as evidence. But who's using the evidence and for what purpose? Is it the community remembering their actions? Is it law enforcement building a case that is meant to demonstrate something that may or may not be true? Is it a scholar? Like who's using the evidence and for what purpose? And what are you providing by making a web archive? Documenting the Now, I think, also does a really excellent job of unpacking some of those factors, especially with social media. So definitely encourage you to check them out. So the collecting with your plan in mind, and then, just start experimenting, see what you get. And if it's not what you want, or if there are points for improvement, if you have a vendor who you're paying, get in touch with them or read their documentation to see if there are ways to troubleshoot any issues you're having. And I keep going back to testing because it is so boring. It is so tedious and it is so necessary. If you just kind of set it and forget it, if you're just like, I'll put a bunch of URLs and let a robot take care of it and expect I'm going to get something that I actually want, it's not really a great plan. So review your captures. If you can't or don't want to do it yourself, make a web forum and help your work study students understand how to make these evaluations and report problems. It's just so hard to do this well without ensuring that you have what you wanted to get. And by the same token, perfection is not attainable. The pursuit of perfection sometimes will be detrimental. So like how you make that call is really like up to you and the purposes of your collection. I won't be touching today on description, access, and preservation. It's, those are multiple subsequent webinars. And, some of the upcoming webinars will cover some of the topics that I've talked about so far today. So for significant properties, I've talked about it a few times. And when I start speaking with colleagues or students about significant properties, like what do I mean by that? I often start with the example of a glass of water. So this is a picture I took yesterday, I believe, of a glass of seltzer water in a pint glass that has the logo of a local brewery in New England. So if you wanted to keep a reference to this around, what would you care about? Sure, it might depend on what your organization cares about. Maybe you have a collection that, cares particularly about microbreweries of New England. Maybe you're a glassware collection. Maybe you are more interested in the fact that there are bubbles here and it's seltzer than if it's water. Maybe the glass is half full or half empty, depending on how you view things. So there are a lot of different factors that make this what it is. Is it that it's made out of glass? Is it shape? Is, what factors make this what it is and isn't? And then for another way of thinking about this is the same object, just from a very different perspective. Does this and this give you the same points and purposes? What information do you get from this versus this? Or if you had both, what would you understand? Or what would you be able to determine? This may seem like a trivial example, but I hope it kind of can help you understand going to this next idea. So this is a screenshot of Metro's homepage in 2008, pretty close actually to when I moved to New York. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island now, but I lived in New York for quite a while. So looking at this, you've got some good information here, but this RSS feed leads to just garbage. And for those of you who have, even remember or, employ what RSS does, it was just basically like to be a ready, like a listing of prior content posted. This calendar page is like, doesn't look great, but it doesn't look as bad as most calendar pages of that era in web archives. So, is this good enough? There's a good chance this is good enough, maybe for your purposes. Is this good enough? Probably not. This was, I went to go back and find like a job post or something, and it wasn't in the Wayback Machine. Fine. Why? Because of a server error. Okay. So I went to see if it was still on the live web. It wasn't. Another example is if you go the whole way back to 2001 for Brandeis University, if you go kind of like this half of the screenshot, that's probably pretty close to what it was, if I recall correctly. That image is missing. I went kind of cruising around the archive and found some stuff went to like, an error or something that was missing. And I'm obviously not going to be able to go back out to the live web to get what was present a whole like 20 years ago, because those, page addresses now have different content in a lot of cases. However, this is pretty accurate to what it was. This fellowship, which I applied for and actually got, but I mean, it was a pretty simple page, right? Like this is a clear communication of what was there and what it was for. So, you know, these are the ways that I start to frame these concepts. And then, you know, you can go further and to things that really matter, especially right now, is does the video play? Do the comments expand? Can you get from one profile to another seamlessly in a web archive? And those are all just like the next hops out. When I'm explaining what significant properties are at the most essential level, this is where I start. So let's do a very quick touch of two things there. So the takeaway from today is just like web-based materials are way too important to give up on. This is not easy, but like, you know, where does web archiving fit into your current work, and where can it build on your current work, or does certain work need to expand to include web archives? You know, figuring that out. And then also just something is better than nothing, as long as that something has been gathered with intent and managed and kind of stewarded adequately or somewhat adequately. Like, you know, really time is of the essence and the stuff will go away. We've seen that. Upcoming, this is the first of a 5-part series. The next session is on March 2nd, and it will be featuring team members working on Archipelago. And Archipelago is really, really an exciting project, and I hope you join us to check that part of the presentation out. And also, there are 2 wonderful archivists from Carnegie Hall who have started a web archiving program in 2018, and it did start with the, oh no, this whole resource is going away, what do we do? And has really grown into some other really interesting points for doing web archiving on a sustainable scale. So I'm looking forward to them being able to tell you a little bit more about the work that they did and some of the work that I helped them do. After that, we'll have a session on web archiving ethics and implications. As I had referred to, we'll do one on tools, kind of to do web archiving, like what your options are. As much as I've kind of talked around and apologized for what's available, there are some things available. And a representative from Archivate, I think, will also be able to join us and really speak to what it can and can't accomplish. And I think that'll be really helpful for people to understand. And then learning from long-term leading web archiving initiatives. Sumitra Duncan from NIARC, the New York Art Resources Consortium. She has led a really amazing program for the better part of a decade in partnership with colleagues. And Alex Thurman, also for, I think, over a decade now, has been really the linchpin in Columbia's longstanding web archiving program. And I'm, of course, a little bit, you know, think of them as 2 colleagues I really respect and like a lot. So I'm excited for them to be able to share all the work that they've been doing over the years as, you know, example, inspiration, or point for people learning from further. Okay, bye for now, everyone. Thank you.